Milestones arrive in the River City. It's an anniversary for Duval County as Consolidated Government turns 55. And how is Mayor Donna Deegan doing in her first months on the job? Chris Hand joins us to talk about the mayor's first 100 days. Plus a discussion with an international researcher and anthropologist. What are the risks to human rights when it comes to artificial intelligence? On This Week in Jacksonville. And welcome today as we engage in our monthly segment with Chris Hand called Hand on Government. And Chris, I'd like to start here. An anniversary or a birthday of sort. Our first topic, let's talk about October 1st is 55 years since the consolidated city of Jacksonville happened. And I know this is something you've been passionate. You've educated me a lot over the years on what that is and why this is unique. Why is it important to recognize this 55-year mark?
Well, Kent, because Jacksonville, 55 years ago today, October 1st, 1968, the city of Jacksonville merged with Duval County to form what is one of the largest local governments in the entire United States, which is the largest city by area in the contiguous United States, more than 840 square miles, and what is the 12th most populated city in the entire United States. It was, our colleague Rick Mullaney likes to say that it was perhaps the largest and most significant governmental reform and restructuring in kind of the recent history of Florida. And I think Rick's right. It was very significant in that you have to remember what happened before consolidation, why it came about. Jacksonville was really in a tough spot, and Channel 4 was very active through its government by Gaslight and other series in helping to expose some of those problems. But a very polluted St. Johns River, a school system that had been disaccredited, a situation where the city was having major budget challenges, a government that was considered very bureaucratic. At the time, there was a city commission, city commissioners, and a city council, and a county government, and then numerous local government officials were indicted for corruption. Jacksonville was really in a crisis period, and as local leaders came together trying to find the appropriate reform to kind of help put Jacksonville on the right trajectory again, they settled on consolidation, which was aimed at trying to achieve efficiency and accountability in government, bring the entire community together. And now, 55 years later, there's been a lot of lessons that have been learned from that history.
So let's dive in a little bit. But I want to point out, Chris wrote the 50th anniversary edition of A Quiet Revolution, the Consolidation of Jacksonville, Duval County, and the Dynamics of Urban Political Reform. So, Chris, you've mentioned in recent years, you said you love the City of Jacksonville Charter. Maybe explain that. Why?
Sure. Well, that's our local constitution, and the way that the federal government is sort of governed by the United States Constitution, the state of Florida is governed by the Florida Constitution. The City of Jacksonville is governed by the charter, and many counties in Florida have a charter, which is like our local constitution. It sets the basic architecture of our local government, provides the powers that local government has and doesn't have, and ensures the operation of our government going forward. So the charter is sort of the bedrock of our consolidated system, and the architecture and kind of main way our government operates is through that local constitution.
So in A Quiet Revolution there, so you had 5 questions for the future of consolidation. Where do we stand on those? Do those still apply?
Well, I think they most certainly do. When I wrote this book, the update to this book, the original one was kind of written in 1968 when consolidation first passed, and several people have updated it since then. I had the honor to update it at the 50th anniversary, and one of the approaches I took during this update was to focus on what does the future of consolidation look like, and really tried to identify those 5 questions. And I'll just touch on a couple of them. One is, will we kind of end the tale of 2 cities? And what I mean by that, and we've talked about it on this program before, when the consolidation campaign was happening in 1967, there were promises made to neighborhoods in Jacksonville about how quality of life would improve if consolidation was passed. Replacing septic tanks and putting in central sewer, paving streets, lighting streets, having drainage improvements. And these were all over the community, but particularly concentrated in East and Northwest Jacksonville. And so consolidation passed, And there's been concern over time that the promises that were made in that 1967 consolidation campaign that resulted in voters passing it and consolidation starting 55 years ago today have not been fulfilled over time. So there's still work to do on that. There have been different sort of elements of the city government, different periods in city government where there have been efforts made to try and address those. But one of the concerns is there hasn't been a sustained period of trying to address them. So as a result, there are still a lot of streets that aren't paved or aren't illuminated. There are still a lot of people who are operating on septic tanks and haven't been moved to central sewer. That was actually something that Mayor Deegan talked about in her campaign about funding infrastructure. When Mayor Curry was in office, he talked about it some and wanted to fund infrastructure. So I think one of the hopes as we commemorate this 55th anniversary is that we figure out a way as a community once and for all to address the unfulfilled promises of consolidation and make sure the benefits of consolidation extend to the entire community, no matter where you live in this 840 square mile county.
It was supposed to make an impact for everybody in Duval County and part of that, and it hasn't been the case. Let's shift topics a little bit here. City Council just this past week voted on and unanimously approved the new fiscal year 23 and 24 budget for the city of Jacksonville. $1.7 billion. Plenty of debate going in there, but in the end, it was no opposition to passing this budget.
That's right, and I think it's important for people to remember how the annual budget process works. It's a very tough thing for a new mayor and that mayor's administration to deal with, because as you'll recall, a mayor is sworn in on July 1st. Well, in this case, Mayor Deegan and her team had 16 days until July 17th to finalize and propose a budget. And the new council members who are just kind of learning the building. And
about half of them are brand new
That's right,
members.
Yeah. Now get this proposed $1.7 billion budget, and they have to sort of deal with that kind of going forward. So everybody's in a little bit of a difficult position. But the way it works under our charter, the document you were talking about earlier, is the mayor proposes an annual budget, and the city council, though, has the ultimate authority to adopt a final budget and a final millage rate or property tax rate going forward. So the process we saw this year is not unlike in previous years. The mayor proposed a budget. Council made a series of changes to it. That's not unusual. And council, historically, certainly in my time at City Hall, took a lot of, really felt strongly about its role in that process. So the final budget never looks like the original budget did, and this year was no different.
I think we're going to extend our conversation on budget into the next segment as well, but we'll wrap up this segment on this. The mayor said in a statement after that unanimous passage of the budget, this final budget makes generational investments to ensure Jacksonville citizens are healthy, safe, housed, and thriving. How?
Well, I think from her perspective, looking at some of her priorities, the council maintained $10 million in unrestricted resiliency infrastructure funding, invested about $60 million in downtown Jacksonville. Much of the budget is appropriated to public safety. The sheriff's office, just under $600 million. Jacksonville Fire Rescue Division, just under $400 million. But I think what the mayor's probably referring to is a lot of those infrastructure investments. She talked about that during the campaign, and that's been a sort of something she's focused on in the administration so far. But again, it was a process where the mayor proposed a number of things, but didn't necessarily get everything she wanted in the budget. Council made changes. There were some positions that she wanted to put in the budget that council decided to appropriate that money elsewhere. There were other shifts. Council put some money in, for example, for improvements on 121 Financial kind of baseball park here in Jacksonville. So it's always a give and take in this budget process. No mayor ever receives 100% of what they've proposed, but it looks like in this case, there was some relative consensus. And there's always some question about, will a mayor exercise her line item veto authority on a budget? Mayor Deegan has, I believe, indicated that she's not going to veto anything in this budget. So what council passed will be our budget for the next fiscal year.
Is that unusual at all? Is that a big deal that the mayor would say, I'm not going to veto anything?
I think it's atypical for a mayor to veto items in the budget. It's not unprecedented, but it is atypical to do that. I think what'll be, more interesting to watch, there was some other appropriations legislation that was passed as part of that budget, funding for nonprofits outside of the budget that proved to be somewhat controversial. I think people who have speculated about the potential of a mayoral veto have focused more on some of those grants because they kind of went outside the typical city process. But it is a power the mayor has, either a line item veto on the budget or vetoes on typical pieces of legislation.
All right, so Chris, stay nearby. And when we come back, we're considering the first 3 months of the new administration. What to make of Mayor Deegan's first 100 days? That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And thanks for staying with us today as we speak with government law attorney Chris Hand. Chris, let's dive a little deeper into the first 100 days of Mayor Donna Deegan's administration here in the city of Jacksonville. And there's a new city council. I mentioned it last segment, but about half of the city council new to this position. What do we see in this first 3 months or so?
Well, that's always a milestone at any administration, whether it's presidential or gubernatorial, mayoral. That first 100 days is sort of a typical and historical benchmark for the administration. And, as we talked about in the first segment, there's a lot in the first 100 days for a new mayor that is out of their control. You have to very quickly submit, a budget to the council, and a lot of the focus is spent on that. But there still are some opportunities to begin to sort of exhibit what your priorities are, show what the style and the focus of your administration is going to be. And I think we've seen that in several ways with Donna Deegan. For example, she has, she talked about in her campaign about trying to get out, reconnect people to City Hall. She's been having a series of community conversations in council districts around the city, trying to kind of bring City Hall to them, make sure that she as mayor is connected to people around the community. That's an important thing, it's an important step to take early on because it helps to communicate what kind of mayor you're going to be in terms of staying in touch with your constituents. It's also a time where you're kind of hiring staff, putting those in place, and that is not surprisingly, there are parts of that sometimes go well and sometimes don't go well. Much of Mayor Deegan's staff has been approved. There were a couple of proposed staff members, one her proposed director of neighborhoods and her first pick for general counsel, who apparently didn't have support on city council, so both ultimately sort of withdrew. So again, so much of that first 100 days is taken up by the budget that you're kind of working on a lot of priorities like building your communication style, working on outreach. I think in many ways for a new mayor in Jacksonville, given our budget strategy, it's that next 100 days which is particularly crucial in setting forth what an administration is about, what they're going to focus on, how they're going to govern. They're past the budget now. They don't have to worry about that for another year. Now they can focus on how are they going to pursue and advance their priorities in every aspect of the mayoral governing, whether that's in legislation via city council, whether that's in outreach to the community, whether that's working cooperatively with other branches of government like the federal government or the state government. Now is really the time, now past the budget, where a mayoral administration can really cement their image, their focus, their priorities as they move forward.
Well, and I may have the number wrong, but I know council was trying to, and there was some debate about it, but okay, we're not going to touch this pool of money, $20 or $30 million, right? And that, as I understand it, maybe you can explain it for us, is designed to be able to allow the mayor to say, okay, my transition team had these thoughts and these. How does that money work, or is that part of this next 100 days we'll look for?
It is. So what it worked, council set aside $25 million in general appropriations that the mayor asked for in her budget. She's had a series of transition committees staffed by citizens who are going to be coming back with recommendations on a variety of city issues. She wanted to preserve some money in the budget that if they had recommendations that would require city appropriations, the money would already be set aside for that. Now, just to be very clear, and Council President Salem was very clear about this in the final budget meeting, again, under our charter, the power to appropriate funding rests solely and exclusively with the city council. So The mayor and her team will probably bring proposals back to council to use some of that $25 million. But again, it will have to go through the council process. It will have to receive a council majority, or in the case of capital funding, now that we're past the budget, maybe a council supermajority to pass some of that funding. So, but this next 100 days is really critical, and making sure there's a good early impression, that people understand what the focus and the mission of the administration is. That's important from day one. But when you get to the end of this first 100 days and get to the second one, this second period is especially important now that you're past the budget, to make sure the community knows what's the Deegan administration going to focus on, how are they going to pursue those priorities.
Chris Hand, our hand on government segment, thanks so much for the time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ken.
Well, stay with us, and we're going to investigate an element of artificial intelligence that you may not have given much thought. The human rights at risk with AI. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
And this week I had a great conversation with Dr. Alexa Haggerty, joining us from her home in Toulouse, France. Haggerty is an anthropologist researching human rights, science, and technology, and her research has received honors and funding from the National Science Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and the American Ethnological Society, among others. In just a few weeks, though, she's going to be speaking at a Tedex Jacksonville event about this new era of artificial intelligence.
Well, what's interesting about AI is that it's this big umbrella term that's, in some ways, it's more of a marketing term than anything else, but so many things fit under it. So the human rights implications of something like using facial recognition technology in policing are going to be really different than something like the rights implications of having a automated decision system look at social benefits or review a mortgage application. So those different technologies do very different things, and then they have different kinds of possible harms.
Dr. Haggerty, in your research beyond AI, what led you down this path where you said, ooh, I need to investigate this?
Yeah, well, it was when I was doing my research on political violence and mass graves. So I was looking at genocide, and I began to think, well, what leads up to these acts of terrible violence? What happens before a society falls apart to the point that you have mass graves? And I started to think about surveillance and misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And then I began to think about all the new technologies that I was seeing that actually supercharge exactly those things. So that's where I really began to get worried and think about the human rights implications of these AI technologies.
No, you're going to be coming to Jacksonville to talk to our crowd here for Tedex Jacksonville. What's the message there? And I know you have to squeeze a lot probably into that 12-minute talk.
Yeah, there's a lot to say. But the thing that I want to tell people about is that data can be very dangerous, and the ways in which our data is being collected and used by big tech right now has direct consequences for human rights. So we really need to think about how our data is being used and think about how we can get tech companies under democratic control.
So it sounds like there's probably a political connection at some point with regulating and how AI is going to be handled, especially when it comes to that topic of human rights.
Absolutely. AI regulation is coming. It's being led right now by Europe, but it's also coming in the US. And it is a political issue because if you think like these tech companies are so big and powerful, like Apple is equivalent to the 8th wealthiest country in the world. So we're really looking at these kind of new forms of power where we used to just think about nation states. Now we have to think about technology companies. And actually Denmark created a special diplomatic post that's something like the ambassador to tech, and they sent that guy to Silicon Valley. So we're really kind of, it's like a new geopolitical landscape.
Jacksonville leaders say, hey, we want to be a hub of some of the new technology. Certainly financial technology, fintech is something that there's a big focus here in Northeast Florida right now. But along with those potential positives that can come economically and reputationally, all of that, sounds like from your perspective, there probably needs to be some caution.
Absolutely. I mean, I get why everyone's excited about AI. AI is exciting. It is very powerful, but with great power comes great responsibility. So when we're looking at things like fintech, we need to look at the history of mortgage lending and redlining and make sure that we are not, because history is written in data, to make sure that we are not unintentionally replicating problems of the past in our futuristic technologies.
You mentioned to me that there's a case from Broward County, Florida, that is very important to consider. Tell us about that.
Yes, this is one of the first cases that really brought people's attention to the bias that can be encoded into AI and machine learning and the real human consequences it can have. So it was looking at a system called Compass, and investigative journalists from ProPublica looked at this system, which was designed to predict whether or not someone would commit a crime. So it was going to predict crime in the future. And they discovered that this system was racially biased against Black people. So this is when we began, I think, as a society, this was in 2016, we began to really say, oh, wait a minute, these AI systems that we are adopting because they're exciting, because they're futuristic, because maybe they seem like they're going to be more efficient, particularly in places where, people are stretched thin and there's a lot of work to do, actually have dangers that we weren't thinking about.
And Dr. Haggerty is one of the speakers at Tedex Jacksonville. That conference called Human Nature, focused on AI and education, neurobiology and tech resilience, human connection, and more, takes place October 14th at the WJCT studios right across from the stadium downtown. If you want tickets, there's the link on your screen right there on how to get them. The conference runs from 11 in the morning until 5:15 p.m. and then there's an after-go party too. So next time, 3 terrific guests are lined up. Nat Ford, the leader of JTA, Ann Coglianese, Chief Resilience Officer in Jacksonville, and Dr. Diana Green, the former superintendent of schools in Duval County. This Week in Jacksonville airs each Sunday morning at this time. I'm Kent Justice. Thanks for watching on air on Channel 4 and the CW17 and online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus.
Why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.